Andrew Gleason's hands trembled as he held the pen over his birth certificate, the ink pooling at the tip like a confession waiting to spill. Outside his bedroom window in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the December wind rattled the glass, but inside, time seemed suspended in the moment before he committed fraud. The date read December 8, 1941, one day after Pearl Harbor turned the Pacific Ocean red with American blood. He was 17 years old, and he was about to make himself 19 with 3 careful strokes that would transform a 7 into a 9. The radio downstairs crackled with President Roosevelt's voice still echoing in his mind, a date which will live in infamy. Andrew had listened to those words with his mother gripping his shoulder, her fingers digging in as if she could physically prevent what she knew was coming. But mathematics had always been his language, and the equation was brutally simple. America needed every able body, and he had a body, even if regulations said. It was 2 years too young. He made the alteration. The 7 became a 9. Andrew Michael Gleason, born November 4, 1921, became Andrew Michael Gleason, born November 4, 1919. The forgery was clean, almost elegant in its simplicity. He would join the Navy, serve his country, and perhaps, though he barely admitted this even to himself, escape the suffocating expectations of being the son of 2 Harvard professors who assumed his future was already written in academic journals and tenure-track appointments. 3 weeks later, he stood in the cavernous main hall of Op 20G headquarters in Washington, D.C., drowning in a uniform that hung on his lanky frame like laundry on a line. The Naval Communications Annex building loomed around him, all institutional gray walls and the constant clatter of typewriters that sounded like mechanical rain. His baby face, smooth-cheeked and wide-eyed, drew smirks from passing officers. One lieutenant actually stopped mid-stride to stare, then shook his head, and muttered something about the Navy scraping the bottom of the barrel. Captain Lawrence Safford stood at the front of the orientation room, his face carved from the same granite as his voice. Behind him, a blackboard displayed what looked like mathematical chaos. Strings of 5-digit numbers arranged in columns, overlaid with more numbers, creating a labyrinth that seemed to fold back on itself infinitely. "Gentlemen," Safford began, though his eyes lingered on Andrew with obvious doubt about that classification. "You are looking at JN-25, the Japanese Navy's operational code. 33,333 code groups, 2-layer encryption. First, the original message is encoded using a codebook that assigns 5-digit numbers to words, phrases, and concepts. Then those numbers are enciphered by adding another set of 5-digit numbers from a separate additive book. The result is mathematically impossible to break without both books, which we do not possess. And will never possess." Andrew felt his stomach drop. Mathematically impossible. Those words hung in the air like a death sentence. Around him, the other new recruits shifted uncomfortably, but Andrew's mind was already racing through the implications. If the code was truly impossible to break, why were they here? Why maintain a cryptanalysis unit at all? "Our job," Safford continued, his voice heavy with exhaustion that suggested he had given this speech too many times to too many failures, "is to do the impossible anyway. Because every day we cannot read Japanese communications, American boys die. Wake Island has fallen. The Philippines are collapsing. Our ships are being sunk at a 3-to-1 ratio. We are losing this war, and we are losing it blind." The assignment board posted that afternoon confirmed Andrew's worst fears. While mathematicians from Yale and Princeton were assigned to the cryptanalysis teams, while brilliant minds like Agnes Driscoll, the woman who had broken Japanese codes before, worked in the inner sanctum, Andrew Michael Gleason, Seaman's second class, was assigned to message sorting room 2117. Room 2117 was a windowless box that smelled of cigarette smoke, stale coffee, and desperation. Metal filing cabinets lined every wall, each drawer labeled with dates and intercept station codes. CAS for the Philippines, HYPO for Hawaii, NEGAT for Washington. The messages arrived in canvas bags, hundreds per shift, each one a thin strip of paper covered in 5-digit groups that might contain the location of a Japanese carrier group, or might be a routine weather report. Andrew's job was brutally simple. Sort by date, file by station, pass the priority intercepts to the cryptanalysts upstairs. His supervisor, Chief Petty Officer Morrison, made the hierarchy crystal clear during Andrew's first shift. You touch nothing but the filing. You read nothing. You think about nothing. You are a pair of hands that moves paper from point A to point B. The smart people upstairs will do the actual thinking. Are we clear, kid? They were clear. Andrew spent his first week learning the rhythm of 10-hour shifts that blurred together into a monotonous cycle of sorting, filing, and trying not to fall asleep standing up. The other sorters were older, career-enlisted men who had found comfortable niches in the Navy's bureaucratic machinery. They played cards during breaks, complained about officers, and treated the endless stream of coded messages with the same enthusiasm as sorting laundry. But Andrew could not stop seeing the numbers. Even as his hands performed the mechanical task of filing, his mind cataloged patterns. The messages from CAST had different frequency distributions than those from Hypo. Certain 5-digit groups appeared more often in messages sent on Tuesdays. Some intercepts had headers that seemed to follow sequential patterns while others appeared random. He knew he should ignore it. He was a message sorter, not a cryptanalyst. He had lied about his age to serve his country, and the best way to serve was to follow orders, keep his head down, and not pretend he was something he was not. But mathematics had never cared about hierarchy or appropriate roles. Patterns existed whether anyone was looking for them or not. Late in February, during a midnight shift when Morrison had gone home and Andrew was alone with 3 bags of unsorted intercepts, he made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed if anyone had noticed. He pulled out a small notebook, the kind students used for class notes, and began writing down observations. Not the messages themselves, which would have been a security violation, but metadata, frequencies, distributions. The strange way certain number groups seemed to cluster at the beginning of messages like signposts. The notebook became his secret companion through March and into April. During breaks, while other sorters played gin rummy, Andrew filled pages with tallies and calculations. He noticed that messages between Tokyo and Berlin seemed to use different number ranges than messages within the Pacific Theater. He observed that the additive patterns, those second-layer numbers that made the code mathematically impossible, were not as random as they appeared. On April 15 at 2 o'clock in the morning, surrounded by filing cabinets and the distant clatter of teletype machines, Andrew Gleason saw something that made his hands stop moving. He was holding 2 messages, one from 3 weeks ago and one from yesterday, and the number groups in their headers were related. Not identical, but related in a way that suggested a system, a method, a pattern that repeated. His heart hammered as he pulled more messages, checking headers, comparing sequences. The pattern held. It was subtle, easily missed if you were not looking at thousands of messages over time, but it was there. The Japanese were using indicator groups, specific number sequences at the start of messages that told the recipient which page of the additive book to use for decryption, and those indicators followed a predictable rotation. Andrew looked around the empty room, suddenly aware that he had stumbled onto something that the brilliant cryptanalysts upstairs had missed. Or perhaps they had not missed it. Perhaps they had simply never had someone spend hundreds of hours sorting messages by hand, seeing the forest instead of the individual trees. He closed his notebook and filed the messages properly, but his mind was already racing ahead. If the indicators were predictable, then the additives could be recovered. If the additives could be recovered, then the underlying code groups could be isolated. If the code groups could be isolated, then frequency analysis might reveal patterns. The Japanese code might not be mathematically impossible after all. It might just be mathematically difficult, which was an entirely different problem. As dawn broke over Washington and the day shift began arriving, Andrew Gleason returned to his boarding house with a secret burning in his chest. He was 17 years old, he had lied to get here, and he might have just found the key to breaking the Unbreakable code. Now he just had to figure out what to do about it. The split happened in Andrew's mind like a fault line cracking open, revealing something that had been hidden beneath the surface all along. It was 2:00 a.m. on April 23rd, and he had been staring at message headers for so long that the numbers had begun to swim before his eyes like fish in dark water. Then suddenly they weren't swimming anymore. They were organizing themselves into 2 distinct streams, as clear as if someone had drawn a line down the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Andrew spread 60 intercept messages across the sorting table, arranging them by route rather than date. Tokyo to Berlin. Berlin to Tokyo, Tokyo to Berlin. The pattern emerged like a photograph developing in chemical solution. Every message from Tokyo to Berlin used code groups beginning with letters A through M. Every message from Berlin to Tokyo used code groups beginning with letters N through Z. The split was absolute, perfect, and utterly invisible unless you were looking at volume rather than individual messages. His hands shook as he pulled his notebook from his jacket pocket. The observation seemed too simple, too obvious. Surely the cryptanalysts upstairs had noticed this. Surely Agnes Driscoll, who had broken Japanese diplomatic codes in the 1920s, had seen this elementary division. But as Andrew flipped through his weeks of observations, he realized why they might have missed it. The cryptanalysts worked with individual messages, focusing on the mathematical complexity of the two-layer encryption. They were looking at the trees with such intensity that the forest had become invisible. Andrew was seeing the forest because he had spent 3 months doing nothing but sorting trees. He began testing his theory with pencil and paper, working through the night shift while Morrison snored in the supervisor's office. If the alphabet split was intentional, a way to prevent confusion between messages traveling different routes, then it might extend to other aspects of the code structure. He pulled messages from different time periods, checking whether the split held consistent. It did. February messages showed the same pattern as April messages. The system was stable, which meant it was structural, which meant it could be exploited. By dawn, Andrew had filled 6 notebook pages with calculations. He had taken 30 messages whose general content was known from context, routine weather reports, acknowledgments of receipt, standard operational phrases, and tried to work backward from the encrypted groups to the underlying code numbers. His first attempt yielded gibberish. His second attempt produced numbers that were close but not quite right. His third attempt, using the alphabet split as a constraint, achieved something remarkable. He correctly identified the underlying code groups in 22 out of 30 messages. 73% accuracy, from nothing but pattern recognition and pencil work. Andrew walked home that morning through streets already thick with Washington's humid spring heat, his mind churning through possibilities. 73% was not enough. The Navy could not base strategic decisions on a method that was wrong more than a quarter of the time. But it was a start, a crack in the wall that everyone else had declared impenetrable. If he could refine the method, increase the accuracy, prove that the pattern was real and exploitable. He spent the next week working in a fever of concentration that made his roommates think he was sick. During his shifts, he sorted messages with mechanical efficiency while memorizing header patterns. During his off hours, he filled notebook after notebook with calculations, testing variations of his method. He discovered that the alphabet split was just the surface. Beneath it lay a more complex structure. The indicator groups at the start of each message were not random, but followed a rotating schedule tied to the date and time of transmission. The Japanese had built a system they thought was secure because of its mathematical complexity, but they had introduced predictability to make it usable. Every security system faced the same fundamental tension. Make it too complex and your own operators cannot use it reliably. Make it too simple and the enemy can break it. The Japanese had chosen a middle path, and that path had left footprints. By May 3rd, Andrew had refined his method to 81% accuracy. He could take an intercepted message, examine its header, determine which additive page had been used, and recover the underlying code groups with 4 out of 5 reliability. It was not perfect, but it was better than the 5% success rate the official cryptanalysis teams were achieving through brute force and guesswork. The question that kept Andrew awake at night was what to do with this knowledge. He was a 17-year-old message sorter who had lied about his age to join the Navy. He had no credentials, no authority, no reason to expect that anyone would listen to him. The cryptanalysis teams included some of the finest mathematical minds in America, Yale professors, Princeton researchers, professional codebreakers with decades of experience. What were the odds that a teenager had found something they had all missed? But the numbers did not lie. 81% accuracy was 81% accuracy, regardless of who had achieved it. Mathematics did not care about age or rank or credentials. A pattern was either real or it was not, and this pattern was real. On May 7th, Andrew requested a meeting with Lieutenant Commander Angstrom, the officer who oversaw the message sorting division. Angstrom was a career administrator, a man who had found his niche in the Navy's bureaucratic machinery and defended it with the ferocity of a territorial animal. He received Andrew in his office with barely concealed annoyance, glancing at his watch as if calculating how many minutes of his valuable time this interruption would waste. "What is it, Gleason? If this is about leave time, submit the proper forms." Andrew placed his notebook on the desk. His mouth was dry, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. "Sir, I've been observing patterns in the JN-25 intercepts. I believe I've found a method for recovering the additive groups without possessing the codebook." The silence that followed was so complete that Andrew could hear the clock on the wall ticking. Angstrom stared at him with an expression that cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally settled on something close to anger. "You've been doing what?" "Observing patterns, sir, in the message headers. There's a systematic structure to how the Japanese rotate. They're additive pages, and if you map it across multiple messages, Seaman Gleason." Angstrom's voice had gone very quiet, which was somehow more frightening than if he had shouted. "You are here to file papers, not to play Codebreaker. We have trained cryptanalysts, mathematicians from the finest universities in the country, working on JN-25. Are you suggesting that you, a message sorter who has been in the Navy for less than 6 months, have discovered something that they have all missed?" "I'm not suggesting anything, sir. I'm showing you the mathematics." Andrew opened his notebook, revealing pages of calculations. The alphabet split in the Tokyo-Berlin traffic, the rotating indicator groups, the predictable. Angstrom slammed his hand on the desk, making Andrew jump. "I don't care about your amateur mathematics. Your job is to sort and file. That is all. If you have time to play detective with classified materials, then clearly you are not being given enough work. Consider your shift extended to 12 hours, effective immediately." "But sir, if you would just look at the accuracy rates." "Dismissed, Seaman. And if I hear that you have been wasting time on unauthorized analysis again, you will find yourself scrubbing latrines instead of sorting messages. Do I make myself clear?" Andrew stood at attention, his notebook still open on the desk, his carefully documented breakthrough dismissed without even a glance at the evidence. "Yes, sir, crystal clear." He returned to room 2117 with his notebook and his 81% accuracy rate and the crushing realization that being right meant nothing if no one would listen. The other sorters had heard about his meeting with Angstrom. Gossip traveled fast in the close quarters of Op 20G, and they treated him with a mixture of pity and amusement. Morrison pulled him aside during break and offered what he probably thought was kindness. "Kid, I'm going to give you some advice. You're smart, I can see that, but smart doesn't matter in the Navy. What matters is knowing your place. You're a sorter, they're the code breakers, that's how it works. You try to cross that line, you're just going to get yourself hurt." Andrew nodded and said nothing, but in his mind he was already planning his next move. He would keep refining his method, keep documenting patterns, keep building his case until it was so overwhelming that even Angstrom could not ignore it. He was 17 years old, he had lied to get here, and he had found something real. He just needed someone to listen. The opportunity came sooner than he expected, though not in any way he could have anticipated. On May 9th, the radio traffic from Japanese stations exploded. The volume of intercepts doubled, then tripled. Messages poured into room 2117 in canvas bags that arrived every hour instead of every shift. The cryptanalysts upstairs worked around the clock, their exhaustion visible in the way they stumbled through the halls like sleepwalkers. Something big was coming. Every person in Op 20G could feel it, a pressure building like a storm front moving across the Pacific. The Japanese were planning a major offensive, and American intelligence was reading only 5% of their communications. Admiral Nimitz was flying blind, trying to position his carriers to defend against an attack that could come from anywhere, at any time, with any objective. Andrew sorted messages with mechanical efficiency while his mind raced through calculations. In his notebook, hidden in his locker, he had documented enough patterns to potentially read 40% of the traffic. Maybe more. But he was a message sorter, and message sorters did not break codes, and trying to cross that line had already earned him humiliation and extended shifts. He filed another message, then another, watching the intelligence crisis unfold in real time through the sheer volume of paper passing through his hands. American boys were going to die because no one could read these messages. Ships were going to sink, battles were going to be lost, and he had a method that might help, gathering dust in a locker because he was 17 and had no credentials and had already been told to stay in his lane. The mathematics did not care about lanes, patterns did not respect hierarchy. And somewhere in the Pacific, Japanese carriers were moving toward a target that American intelligence could not identify, carrying planes that would kill American sailors, unless someone could break the code that everyone said was unbreakable. Andrew closed another filing cabinet and made a decision that would either save lives or end his naval career. He was done asking permission. The next time opportunity presented itself, he would take it, regardless of consequences. Because 81% accuracy meant something, even if Lieutenant Commander Angstrom was too blind to see it. The storm was coming, and Andrew Gleason intended to be ready when it broke. The briefing room on May 11, 1942, contained more brass than Andrew Gleason had seen in his entire naval career. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood at the head of the table, his weathered face carved into lines of concentration as Captain Safford gestured at a map of the Pacific that looked like a battlefield of pins and string. Around the table sat commanders, captains, and intelligence officers whose combined experience represented centuries of naval service. And in the back corner, barely visible behind a filing cabinet, stood Seaman Second Class Andrew Gleason, who was supposed to be delivering message folders and then disappearing like a ghost. The folders trembled in Andrew's hands, not from nervousness about the assembled authority, though that was considerable, but from what he had seen in the past 72 hours. The Japanese radio traffic had reached a crescendo that made the previous surge look like a whisper. Messages were pouring in so fast that the sorting room had fallen behind. By 6 hours, then 12, then 18. The cryptanalysts upstairs were drowning in intercepts they could not read, trying to find patterns in chaos while the clock ticked toward whatever catastrophe was building in the Western Pacific. And Andrew knew, not everything, not perfectly, but enough. His method had evolved over the past week of frantic refinement. The alphabet split, the rotating indicators, the predictable additive patterns, they all pointed to something massive being coordinated across multiple Japanese naval groups. He had spent last night's shift working through intercepts with his notebook hidden under routine filing, and the picture that emerged made his blood run cold. 4, maybe 6 carrier groups, a major invasion force, timing in early June. And a target designated by the code group AF that appeared in 70% of the traffic. Gentlemen, Nimitz was saying, his voice carrying the weight of a man who knew he was making decisions that would determine whether America won or lost the Pacific War. We are facing an intelligence crisis of unprecedented magnitude. Hypo believes the Japanese are planning a major offensive. Cass concurs. But we cannot determine the target, the timing, or the force composition with any certainty. We are reading approximately 5% of JN25 traffic, which means we are making strategic decisions based on fragments and guesswork. Captain Safford stepped forward, his exhaustion visible in the gray pallor of his skin. Admiral, our cryptanalysts are working around the clock. Agnes Driscoll has been at her desk for 36 hours straight. The Yale team has tried every mathematical approach we know. The code is simply too complex. Without the Japanese code books, we're trying to solve an equation with too many unknowns. Then we need to reduce the unknowns, Nimitz said quietly. Because if we position our carriers wrong, if we defend the wrong objective, we will lose them. And if we lose our carriers, we lose the Pacific. It's that simple. Andrew felt his legs moving before his brain had fully processed the decision. He was walking forward around the filing cabinet, past the junior officers who turned to stare at this baby-faced seaman who was violating every protocol by approaching the senior staff table. His mouth was dry, his heart hammering, but his hands had stopped trembling. The mathematics was either right or it was wrong, and if it was right, then rank and protocol and appropriate channels meant nothing compared to the lives that would be saved. Admiral Nimitz, sir. His voice came out steadier than he expected. I believe I can help. The room erupted. A commander Andrew did not recognize surged to his feet, his face flushing red. Who the hell is this sailor? Get him out of here. Lieutenant Commander Angstrom appeared from somewhere behind Andrew, grabbing his arm with fingers that dug in like claws. Gleason, you are out of line. Admiral, I apologize for this. Interruption, but Nimitz had raised one hand, and the room fell silent with the kind of instant obedience that only a man of his authority could command. His eyes fixed on Andrew with an intensity that felt like being examined under a microscope. You're the message sorter. I've seen you making deliveries. Yes, sir, Seaman Second Class Andrew Gleason, and you believe you can help us break JN-25. It was not quite a question, but not quite a statement either. Nimitz's tone suggested he was reserving judgment, waiting for evidence before deciding whether this was courage or insanity. Andrew pulled his notebook from his jacket pocket. The room's atmosphere shifted from outrage to something more complex, a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, like watching someone claim they could perform magic. Sir, I've been observing patterns in the message headers for the past 3 months. The Japanese are using a rotating indicator system for their additive groups. It's predictable and it can be exploited. This is absurd, Safford interjected, though his voice lacked the heat of the other officers' reactions. He sounded more exhausted than angry. Admiral, we have trained cryptanalysts who have been working on this problem for months. The idea that a message sorter has found something they missed. Let him speak, Nimitz said, and those 3 words changed everything. The Admiral gestured to the table. Show me. Andrew's hands were steady now as he opened his notebook. The pages were covered in his cramped handwriting, columns of numbers and calculations that represented hundreds of hours of observation. The Japanese split their alphabet for Tokyo-Berlin traffic. Messages from Tokyo use code groups A through M. Messages from Berlin use N through Z. This suggests they're concerned about operator confusion, which means they've introduced structural predictability to make the system usable. He flipped to another page, aware that every eye in the room was now fixed on his notebook. The indicator groups at the start of each message follow a rotating schedule. I've mapped the rotation across 2 months of traffic. Once you know the schedule, you can determine which additive page was used for any given message. And once you know the additive page, you can recover the underlying code groups through frequency analysis and contextual guessing. Thomas Dyer, one of the senior cryptanalysts from Hypo, leaned forward. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of intense focus that suggested he saw the world as a series of puzzles waiting to be solved. What's your accuracy rate? 81% on test messages where I knew the general content. Lower on completely unknown traffic, but still significantly better than random chance. The silence that followed was different from before. It was not the silence of outrage, but of calculation, of brilliant minds rapidly processing implications. Dyer stood and walked around the table, holding out his hand for the notebook. Andrew gave it to him, watching as the cryptanalyst flipped through pages, his eyes moving rapidly across the calculations. The alphabet split, Dyer said slowly. We noticed that months ago. Dismissed it as coincidence because it didn't appear to affect the underlying encryption. But if you use it as a constraint on the additive recovery. He looked up at Andrew and there was something like respect in his eyes. The kid might be on to something. Might be is not good enough, the red-faced commander said. Admiral, we cannot base strategic decisions on the observations of a teenage message sorter. We can test it, Nimitz interrupted. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. Captain Safford, I want your best cryptanalyst working with Seaman Gleason. 72 hours. If his method produces actionable intelligence, we use it. If it doesn't, we've lost nothing but time we were going to spend failing anyway. Angstrom's grip on Andrew's arm tightened. Admiral, this sailor has been conducting unauthorized analysis of classified materials. He should be facing disciplinary action, not being given access to. 72 hours, Nimitz repeated, and his tone made clear that the discussion was over. He looked at Andrew, and for just a moment, something that might have been a smile touched the corners of his mouth. You just interrupted an admiral's briefing and claimed you can do what our best cryptanalysts cannot. I hope for your sake that you're right, son. The next 72 hours existed in a space outside normal time, a bubble of intensity where sleep became optional and coffee became the primary food group. They moved Andrew to a small office adjacent to the main cryptanalysis room, where Agnes Driscoll, Thomas Dyer, and a young mathematician named William Hall worked with a focus that bordered on manic. Andrew's notebook became the starting point, but they rapidly expanded beyond it, testing his theories against Thousands of intercepts, refining the indicator rotation schedule, building probability tables for code group recovery. Driscoll was a revelation. She was in her 50s, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. Within the first hour, she had identified 3 errors in Andrew's calculations and 2 ways to improve his accuracy rate. But she did it without condescension, treating him as a colleague rather than a message sorter who had gotten lucky. The alphabet split was clever, she said, working through a particularly difficult intercept. We saw it but didn't understand its significance. You had the advantage of volume, sorting thousands of messages gave you a perspective we lacked. 16 hours into the deadline, they recovered their first complete additive page. Dyer let out a whoop that brought other cryptanalysts running, and for the next hour they tested the recovered additives against new intercepts. The method worked. Not perfectly, there were still errors, still gaps, but they were reading fragments of messages that had been completely opaque before. 36 hours in, running on coffee and adrenaline, they hit the breakthrough. A message from May 9th, previously unreadable, suddenly resolved into clear text when they applied the recovered additives. Hall read it aloud, his voice shaking. Carrier Division 5 to proceed to Point AF for invasion support operations. Estimated arrival June 3rd. AF, Nimitz said when they brought him the decrypt. It was 2 in the morning, but the Admiral looked as alert as if it were noon. We keep seeing that designation. Do we know what it means? Not yet, Driscoll admitted, but we're working on it. The traffic volume suggests it's a major target, possibly Midway, possibly the Aleutians, possibly even Hawaii. Find out, Nimitz said, and find out how many carriers they're sending. The 60-hour mark brought confirmation. A message from Admiral Yamamoto's flagship, partially recovered through Andrew's method and partially through inspired guesswork by Driscoll, revealed the target. AF was Midway Atoll, the tiny island that served as America's westernmost outpost in the Pacific. The Japanese were sending 4 to 6 carriers. The exact number was still unclear, to invade and occupy it, drawing out the American fleet for a decisive battle that would end the war in Japan's favor. 4 to 6 carriers, Nimitz repeated, studying the decrypt. Against our 3. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, if we can get her repaired in time. He looked at the assembled cryptanalysts, his face showing the weight of the decision he was about to make. How confident are we in this intelligence? Dyer glanced at Andrew, then at Driscoll. 70%, Admiral, maybe higher. The method is sound, but we're still working with incomplete information. 70% is better odds than we've had since Pearl Harbor, Nimitz said quietly. He turned to his operations officer. Position Enterprise and Hornet northeast of Midway. Get Yorktown out of Pearl Harbor, even if the repair crews have to work on her while she's underway. If the Japanese are coming to Midway, we're going to be waiting for them. By the 72nd hour, they were reading 40% of Japanese traffic, an improvement so dramatic that even the skeptical officers had to acknowledge something fundamental had changed. Andrew sat in the cryptanalysis room, surrounded by papers and coffee cups and the brilliant minds who had taken his observations and transformed them into actionable intelligence. He was so exhausted that the room seemed to tilt when he stood, but his mind was still racing through patterns, still seeing the structure beneath the chaos. You should sleep, Driscoll said, appearing beside him with a fresh cup of coffee that suggested she did not actually expect him to follow that advice. You've been awake for 3 days, so have you. I'm old, I'm used to it, she smiled, and it transformed her severe face into something almost warm. You did good work, Gleason, better than good. You saw something the rest of us missed because we were too close to the problem. Sometimes the best perspective comes from the outside. The Battle of Midway began on June 4, 1942, at 4:30 hours when Japanese planes launched from 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu. But the American carriers were already in position, already waiting, already launching their own strike groups based on intelligence that told them exactly where to look. The battle lasted all day, a chaos of planes and ships and explosions that Andrew followed through radio reports and decrypt updates, his stomach churning with the knowledge that he had helped put those American pilots in the sky. 5 minutes changed everything. From 10:20 to 10:25 hours, American dive bombers hit 3 Japanese carriers in rapid succession. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu all took fatal damage in those 5 minutes. Their flight decks erupting in fire as bombs detonated among fully fueled aircraft. Huryu lasted until evening before she too was destroyed. 4 Japanese carriers sunk, the cream of their naval aviation wiped out in a single day. The tide of the Pacific War reversed in the time it took to drink a cup of coffee. Andrew learned about the victory while sitting in the cryptanalysis room, surrounded by the team that had made it possible. Dyer brought the news, his face split by a grin that made him look 20 years younger. We got them, all 4 carriers. Nimitz says it's the greatest naval victory in American history. The room erupted in cheers, cryptanalysts hugging each other and shaking hands and laughing with the kind of relief that comes from knowing you have helped prevent catastrophe. Andrew sat quietly, letting the noise wash over him, trying to process what had happened. 3 weeks ago, he had been a message sorter. Now he was part of the team that had broken the Unbreakable code and changed the course of the war. Admiral Nimitz came to the cryptanalysis section on June 6th, after the full scope of the victory had become clear. He walked through the room, shaking hands and offering quiet words of thanks to the men and women who had made the ambush possible. When he reached Andrew, he stopped and studied the young sailor with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see through pretense and protocol to the truth underneath. "How old are you really, Seaman Gleason?" Andrew felt his stomach drop. "Sir, I've seen your service record. The dates don't quite add up, so I'll ask again, how old are you?" There was no point in lying, not to this man, not after everything that had happened. 17, sir. I'll be 18 in November." Nimitz nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "You lied about your age to join the Navy, forged your birth certificate, I'm guessing." "Yes, sir." Andrew stood at attention, waiting for the consequences. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, possibly even criminal charges for fraud. He had known the risk when he made that alteration back in December, and he had accepted it. At least he had done something that mattered before they caught him. But Nimitz did not look angry. He looked thoughtful and maybe a little sad. "You saved the Pacific Fleet, son. Those 4 carriers we sunk at Midway, that was the Japanese Navy's striking power. Without them, they can't maintain offensive operations. You gave us time to build, to train, to turn this war around. Do you understand what that means?" "I think so, sir. It means I'm not going to court-martial you for lying about your age." Nimitz's expression softened slightly. "It also means you're staying in cryptanalysis. We need that brain of yours, and I don't care if you're 17 or 70. You've earned your place here." He extended his hand, and Andrew shook it, feeling the calluses of a career naval officer against his own soft palm. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet," Nimitz said. "This war is far from over, and we're going to need every advantage we can get. You found one advantage. Now help us find more." Andrew watched the Admiral walk away, surrounded by his staff officers, carrying the weight of the Pacific War on his shoulders. Around him, the cryptanalysis room hummed with activity as analysts worked through the latest intercepts, reading Japanese communications with an efficiency that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. His notebook sat on the desk, its pages filled with the observations that had started everything. He was 17 years old. He had lied to get here, and he had just helped win the most important naval battle of the war. The mathematics had been right. The patterns had been real. And somewhere in the Pacific, American sailors were alive because a message sorter had refused to stay in his lane. Andrew pulled a fresh intercept toward him and began working through the indicator. Groups already seeing the structure beneath the numbers. There would be more battles, more codes, more impossible problems that needed solving. But for now, in this moment, he allowed himself to feel what he had accomplished. He had been right, and being right had saved lives. Nothing else mattered.